Good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here for Naropa's Extended Campus and our ongoing free event series, Mindfulness is for Everyone. Again, I'm Jordan Quaglia. I'm an associate professor of psychology here at Naropa, and I'm also the research director in our Center for the Advancement of Contemplative Education. And I'm delighted, deeply grateful, and honored to be joined today by Dr. Siegel, who's the founder of the Mindsight Institute, a clinical professor at UCLA, and author of numerous best-selling books, including this one I was just showing you all here, IntraConnected, Me plus We, Mui, as the integration of self-identity and belonging. And so today we'll be talking about intersections of this book and this work of Dr. Siegel's and my upcoming book that I was just showing you all, From Self-Care to We Care, The New Science of Mindful Boundaries and Caring from an Undivided Heart, which Dan was so gracious to write the foreword to. So thank you again for that, Dan. And I just want to say
Congratulations to you
thank you.
on the book.
Thank you. Thanks.
Absolutely.
And so before we get going, I just want to say thanks to all my colleagues here at Naropa who have helped support and give rise to this event. And yeah, again, thanks, Dan. Is there anything you'd like to say here at the outset of our conversation?
No, again, my apologies for the technological challenges, but maybe they're symbolic of something about patience and getting through. But I'm glad to be here with you, and please call me Dan,
Okay.
unless you want me to call you Professor Qualia.
We'll keep it informal. Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
great.
So Dan, I wondered if we might introduce both of our books, introduce new concepts to the world, and this might be the first time that people are hearing this term intra-connected. Interconnected is a more common term.
Yeah.
Intra-connected is a new one, and same with We Care. So I wondered if we might just begin simply, if you could just briefly introduce what you mean by intra-connected.
Yes, the term intraconnected was something that came to me when I was working with some colleagues we were working together on systems views of reality, and we were taking ourselves on a kind of retreat into the forest. And when we came out of 3 days separated from each other, and everyone was trying to describe the feeling of being in the forest with no other human beings around you, many people spoke about the connection, the interconnection, being interwoven, interlaced. And then it was going around the circle. And when it came time for me to try to say what it was like during those 3 days, I just couldn't use the prefix inter because it had a quality of a betweenness when the feeling in the subjective experience of being there was a withinness. So I couldn't really find the word, and so I finally just said, look, it was more like intra-connected. There was a wholeness that the separation of this body called Dan kind of dissolved, the separation left. And it's not that I lost a sense of self, it's more like the center of experience just expanded beyond the skin. And so interconnected was the word that came up. So when I got back to our technology and I was trying to take some notes on the 3 day experience, every time I typed in intraconnected, the word processor did a spell check and changed it to interconnected. And I realized when I looked it up that there was no word. There is no word intraconnected. And I thought, well, what is the word we use in English to speak from the whole? The connectivity within the whole. So I started, playing around with that word, and I'd already had a word called mui, which was the inner experience we have of self or identity as a me, but also the relational sense as a we. And you don't need to lose the inner when you gain the inter. And so the inner plus the inter becomes the intra. And that was kind of how the word came about and where that book tries to really focus its attention.
Beautiful. Yeah, thanks. In a little bit, I have a question for us both. And by the way, I sort of developed some questions that my hope is that they'll draw out, convergences in our work similar to our initial conversation together, but also some potential differences because I think that those are probably of interest to people too. And
Sure.
so, yeah, just the idea in general of introducing a new term. So my book also is introducing this idea of we care. And we care is really one way of understanding it, a way of expanding on the idea of self care to bridge its principles and practices with scientific insights about our social nature as human beings. And so, in contrast to self care alone, we care means caring for a we. And importantly, this we is flexible. So it can encompass us and just one other person, like me and Dan here, the two of us, or it can encompass us and everyone on this call, or even wider to our whole town or all living beings potentially. And it's also flexible in the sense, and we're going to talk about this, I think, more, Dan, that within that we can emphasize ourselves more with our awareness. We can focus on ourselves more, and we can emphasize others more. And so that inherent flexibility of the word we is something that I find really valuable about the word we. And it turns out that that's also present in many other cultures around the world, that they have a kind of word that's very similar to we and its flexibility. So just to introduce people again to this idea, in essence, we care is about transforming this sense of either or between do I care for myself or do I care for other people from a kind of either or dilemma into a both and practice in which our self care can energize and support our care in the world and our care for others. And our care for others can support and even energize and lend purpose and meaning to our self care practice. And one metaphor that might be helpful is that of breathing. We can mentally divide the breath into the in breath and the out breath, but both are needed to support and sustain our vitality. And so, similarly, I think with we care or with care in general, we can divide it into self care and care for others. But ultimately, they're parts of this interconnected system, and both are needed to sustain our vitality and care in the world.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Beautiful.
Thank you. So another area of convergence, now that we've introduced those terms, is that we both sort of connected around the idea that the term self-compassion and the term self-care may be missing the mark, although perhaps not for reasons that people think. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. For me, it's not so much that self-care and self-compassion are bad or selfish. And so I think we'll talk about how we both, I think, embrace, that broader potential of caring for ourselves. It's not that we're trying to get away from that or having compassion, directing the flow of compassion toward ourselves. But yeah, I think we both have sort of slightly different critiques or concerns about this, and our work connects with that. So why don't we start with you again? I'd love to hear, how do you think about this term self-compassion and maybe self-care as well?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jordan. I think if we just begin with the word self and ask ourselves, what that word means for us personally, what it means for us publicly, and what it means for us planetarily. So, if we begin on the level of the person, and this is where maybe you and I have a little bit of a difference in terms of the word we versus coming up with a new word, which you really want to try to avoid. We already have too many words. But the word we was created in the face of, people seeing we as not including honoring the individual. That there was a collectivism that was more like a blending, so you were not honoring, that there was more like a fruit salad, it was like a smoothie, everything was being homogenized as we think this, we think that. So in modern, life, which I used to say was Western, but the Dalai Lama at a meeting once said, don't call it Western, it's all around the world. This individualism, has created a kind of feeling of, the self is the individual and then there are others. And then the use of the word we is sometimes like obliterating the individual, going all the way collectivistic. So to find the middle ground, I was giving some lectures called From Me to We. And one of my students, who was from the Lakota tribe, she was really very energized to say to me that it was being hypocritical to have a seminar called Me to We, because it was important not to lose the me within the we. And that term, Me to We, implies that. And even the organization Me to We in Toronto that works with youth asked me to write a postscript to their their book that they put out saying that, we was really a more accurate thing of what they were trying to accomplish with the name of their organization, B2E. And maybe even with you, Jordan, with your term self-care. And we've had a big discussion about this. So to come to the word self, in modern culture, especially American culture, which unfortunately, until recently anyway, has stood up as something people wanted to emulate, um, you know, the word self is thought of as a synonym for the individual. And if we've grown up in this culture, you may say, of course, the self is the same thing as individual. But if you really look at the science of studies of the self, then the self is really a center of experience. And if we live in a modern culture like individualistic United States, then sure, the center of experience is in your body, it's skin encased and it's holding your head up and all this stuff. But that view is, I think, not only wrong, but it's killing us. And so the reason I have a problem, and I've expressed this to Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, with them pushing not just the findings of directing compassion inwardly, which is so beautiful and so important, but calling it self-compassion, I think is continuing this unintentional, individualistic view of saying self means the individual. So by having something in my field, attachment research, like self-regulation, or even I've used this term in a book long ago, Parenting from the Inside Out, self-understanding, by using self as an equivalent of the individual, I think we're going to be basically ending life on Earth. I think it's that important. And so I have a problem with self-care, self-regulation, self-understanding, self-compassion, because it keeps on reinforcing, I mean, the individual's care. I mean, the individual's compassion. I mean, the individual's regulation. I mean, the individual's understanding. We need a center of experience that is as robust and important to us, that includes all humanity and includes all of nature. And that is our self, our relational self. So you can continue the beautiful work, for example, in self-compassion, just change the name. I've urged the Chris and Kristen uh, gang to do. And I said, look, if you don't write that book, I'm going to write it soon. But you should be the one to write it, because it's really inner compassion is the beautiful contribution you've made. And people forget to put energy into inner compassion. So you can do everything they do in their great work and just call it mindful inner compassion or just inner compassion. So when we're compassionate for a person who is born into a different body than the body we were born into, and I'm trying to avoid the use of the word other, that is compassion for the self. The self being defined as a center that has subjective experience, that spells the word spa, your sensations, for example, your perspective or point of view, and agency. You act on behalf of that. So we need to, and this is what I felt in that Pando Populous forest where we were for 3 days, that you are the forest. You're not just doing something for the forest that's not you. That forest is you. Those trees, those limbs of your self are the bark encased trunks of a tree. And in Pando, what you see is that 6 inches beneath the surface of the soil, it's one root ball. And you test the DNA, you realize it's the same tree. So on the surface, it looks like, yeah, the self is in the individual body, but actually our self is all of these human bodies and all living beings on Earth.
Mm.
So that's why I have a problem with the term. And that's why, even though I'm also raised in this culture, I struggle and try. And when I achieve it, it feels really, really good to not use the word self to mean the individual. Now, I know you and I have had tension about that when we first met. And I still feel, even though I wrote the foreword for your beautiful book, and I think I said in the foreword, it's a bit of a problem if you think of self-care as equivalent to individual care, and just take it at face value, which some people may, that's actually going to be continuing the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate how you put all of that into this broader frame and even connected it to things like our climate crises or different kinds of pandemics that you talk about and write about in the book, things like racism and social injustice and so on. So there's lots of different ways that maybe this has ripple effects and broader influences. I'm going to get to yeah, the difference that you're highlighting and how I think about the word we in just a moment. But just to start again, I think with this idea of self and putting the word self dash in front of things that you were speaking about, I think we do have agreement quite a bit there, in the sort of potential difficulties or the way that that's missing the mark in some sense. I think my concern is a little bit more about personal well-being, although it's and social well-being and societal well-being. I haven't gone as much in my writing or in the book. I don't focus as much the way that you do in IntraConnected on those broader crises. So I really appreciate that. For me, the concern about self-care and self-compassion is kind of like two main things. The first is that I think that putting the word self dash in front of care and compassion subtly undermines the social essence of these terms. So we know from lots of research that it's very likely that due to the competitive advantages of cooperation, that complex forms of care and compassion evolved in our ancestors first to be directed toward others before we learned to direct them toward our inner selves. And when we put the words,
Yay for inner self.
yes, yes,
That's how to use it. Yay.
yeah,
That's
I'm going
great.
to
Well,
try that as a practice as we're in dialogue here today.
then that felt so good, I got to say. Our inner selves, beautiful. And yeah, I mean, it's great. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, so I think that interestingly, there's lots of frameworks for understanding our basic psychological needs, but many of them converge on this distinction between sort of autonomy needs and connection needs. And interestingly, I think that this self dash repurposes these terms that were meant to, these qualities that were meant to serve connection needs. And I think our connection needs are so underserved in this time. And it sort of repurposes care and compassion from something that could serve our connection needs into something that's intended to serve our autonomy needs. And I know it's not that simple. Definitely, people are practicing self care and self compassion in a more interconnected way. But when we don't have that more interconnected frame for understanding self care and self compassion, then I think it's sort of subtly undermining the social essence of them. And then the second thing, and this one's more critical for me, is I think that when we use the term self care and self compassion, we sort of activate and reinforce this kind of either or mindset between self care and care for others. And we think, oh, I'm either doing one or the other. Like I'm either practicing self compassion and directing compassion toward my inner self, or I'm practicing compassion for others. And we know from research that the sort of downsides of caring that people report happen when we're in a divided mode of care. So, for example, people report as they practice self care, they are feeling guilty or some kind of difficulty in directing that care toward their inner self because they feel like they're being selfish or something to that effect. Or when they're practicing care for others, they may lose themselves or somehow sacrifice themselves and their own needs in that process. So by framing care at this, by dividing care at this sort of self-other joint, I think it's a overly artificial divide. I don't think it's the natural way to divide care. I think the best way to divide care would be to divide it in terms of, it's kind of divide it, conceptually carve care as being either divided or undivided. Or we could say, awake to our interconnectedness or not. And so we care is really about staying awake to the interconnection between our self care and care for others to avoid these extremes of either sort of selfish self care, overly indulgent, materialistic self care, or pathological altruism where we're supporting others so much and sort of undermining our own well-being in the process.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think it certainly resonates with the fundamental principle of uh, integration, where if we define integration as the honoring of differences and the promoting of linkages, where the linkage of those differentiated elements, like the left and right hemisphere, or two people in a relationship, or different species in an ecosystem, the linkage of those differentiated elements does not obliterate the essence of their uniqueness. And so this is where, and maybe we should play with this a little bit here in our conversation. This is where the word we for this body called Dan in the journey I've been on became really necessary, because what my students were telling me was that when they were being told things like I had mentioned, me to we, you know, for whatever their own histories were, they felt that meant leaving their individuality and just joining the flock and melting into the whole of we. Um, and so there was this one student who, when she said, come up with something else, is where the word was invented. I said, well, you need some essence of me and some essence of we that retain themselves when you combine them. It does get lost in we. We doesn't have a me in it, and me doesn't have a we in it, but they share an E. So what if you held on to the M and held on to the W, but kept the E? And I said, what about we? And she said, well, that's it. So this is where for for the journey of this body, what has been so helpful, and when we do it at the end of the wheel of awareness, this meditation we do in the interpersonal neurobiology world I live in, it's an integration of consciousness practice, but at the end, we do this offering of kind regard for an inner experience we have as may I this, may I that, but then we offer it to we. And what's been so interesting um, is that people have on their own said, the liberation of mui over just sending it to other people is that they realize that they need to honor their inner life while they join with others. And that's the essence of integration. So for mui, this has been just a part of the journey. Now, when you and I talked and we chatted about your book, and I know you have the name We Care. I myself would have called it Mui Care if it were in the realm I live in. But when I saw your writings, which are so beautiful, I
Thank you.
realized you were approaching the word we as if it had me embedded in it, which, if that's true, then you and I are aligned completely about this integration of we. For some people, maybe because of their attachment history and trying to
Yeah.
fit into the family and losing their own individual journey to just serve a function for a very disturbed family,
Yeah.
um, they would lose, quote, themselves. They would lose their individual selves. That inner self wouldn't be seen or respected. And so they'd get lost in the we. And that's the last thing they'd want to do with we. So that's where we was very helpful for them. But maybe in the broad sense of society, it's helpful. We're living in a world, literally in this very moment, that is so filled with polarization of, you know, my group and my identity is better than anyone else's, and I'm going to obliterate any respect for anyone different from what I consider to be the source of honoring humanity. And so whatever I choose to do in the position of majority and my position of power is going to wipe out anyone different from what I think they should be.
Mm.
You know, now more than ever, we need, whether you think of it as we or we, either way, we really need that right now. So these things in your book are so important. And, when you take the principle of integration, honoring differences, promoting compassionate linkages, you know, when we don't do that, you get chaos and rigidity, which is what we're seeing literally right now in this country, in the
Yeah.
world even. So integration leads to this harmonious flow, bounded on one side by chaos and rigidity, whether in the moment you think of that as the window of tolerance or across time, a river of integration, it's the same metaphor. There's this flow that's of harmony, that's flexible and adaptive. That's what I think the we and the we, those stances, which are basically the same in what you and I are talking about, um, that's what I think it's trying to promote, is an integrative way to live on earth
Yes.
that really says the fundamental ethical principle, the humanitarian principle, the principle of leading to well-being is integration. And anything that's not honoring these differences and promoting compassionate linkages across the differences is actually a violation of humanity.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation to revisit this aspect of our discussion and to share it with others as well. Um, yeah, when I was writing the book initially, and I came up with this phrase "we care," I really was careful to explore this idea of whether we preserves the sense of self. And so I know that this was I've said this to you, Dan, but in that exploration, what I discovered was not only experientially do I experience that the self being preserved when I say the word we, but also in our everyday usage of the term, it appears that maybe that sort of phrase, moving from me to we, that's gotten associated, and I totally agree with you, it's gotten associated with kind of dissolving me into we in certain contexts and so on. So I agree with that concern, but that it appears to be more philosophical than actually true to the meaning of that term in its everyday usage. Most of the time, when people use the word we, there is a sense of self preservation, not self preservation in the typical sense, but in the sense of preserving the sense of distinction between self. And the word we is a way of acknowledging that interconnectedness. And so, one synonym, that I would say I could use now, or one way, synonymous way of talking about we care would be to say integrated care. And I think that
Yeah.
you know that now, Dan, in reading the book, that I was careful to highlight that this we allows for this range or this flexibility where we can flexibly emphasize ourselves and what we might call our me when we need to, and we can flexibly emphasize others, but we can do so without the sense of inner division that typically accompanies practices like self-care. And so rather than, feeling guilty or something for prioritizing ourselves, when we're awake to the interconnection between caring and looking after ourselves and caring and looking after our broader sense of purpose and others and so on, then we're not going to fall into that excessive differentiation that you talk about in your concept of integration, nor are we going to go to the other extreme and go so far to be into linkage that we lose that sense of differentiation.
Yeah.
So my hope and expectation and sort of framework that I developed is to maintain that sense of distinction. And I just want to say that I really appreciate your word muy. One just personal anecdote about this is recently I my father unfortunately was treated for cancer, and he's doing well. He's recovering well from that. And he texted me afterwards. He read your forward. He got an advanced copy of the book, and he read your forward, Dan. And he texted me, and he felt, the presence of his community showing up for him, and he talked about it as a sense of muy. And so that term really stuck for him. And I just wanted to say thank you for introducing that. I think it's such an elegant term, and I
Oh,
agree with you that it helps to support that sense of integration and make sure that we're not losing sight. And so I think my own
yeah.
commitment, in teaching We Care in the world is to ensure that I'm always careful to explain, to people that the word we in this context does not mean dissolving our sense of self. And in fact, I think We Care promotes naturally healthy boundaries in the way that I developed the framework.
Yeah, I agree,
Yeah.
and that's why I was so honored to be able to write the foreword to your book. First of all, my heart is with you for your dad. Uh,
Thank you.
my mom actually just passed a few months ago, and um, the experience to see her go through things and then come and go into hospice, she was 95 and a half, and then pass on, was so powerful. But whether we call it we, it was so important to hold these two, the differentiated inner experience she had as she was getting near the end of her life, the relational self she had as someone with close relationships with a number of people in the family and in the work she was doing. And then to make sure that as she was getting close to her body being done, she could have both the me of saying what was going on in her body and where she was at 95 and a half,
Mm.
and what the relationships were and how we would carry her forward in the we of the relationships, right? And so I'll just say one thing, and this is not to get all semantic. It's really more
Yeah,
about
sure.
thinking deeply, kind of inspired by a person named Taylor Desjardins, who in the last century, he wrote about something called the noosphere, this atmosphere of knowledge. So for
Hmm.
we care, for example, you're introducing into the noosphere a notion that, let's move from just individual focus to a more integrated focus as you're framing it, which is so
Yeah.
important and so beautiful. Um, and you may tell me, Jordan, that I'm being too invested in looking at words, but let's just, if we could rewind and play the recording of what we've been talking about for the last, let's say, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give you a paraphrase of a way we could be speaking, and you tell me how this sits with you, uh,
Okay.
because it's different from I think than what was articulated just as you were trying to get to this really bigger notion.
Hmm.
Um, and so it goes like this: you say, "We care" is really trying to honor the fact that we can focus on caring for our inner experience as well as caring for ourselves collectively in our relationships and the inner experience of anyone who's a part of the world of care. Now, think about that versus we care is really important because it takes self care and embeds it into how we're caring for others too.
Yeah.
So, this may be a stickler for words, but for me, I want to try to avoid the word other.
Hmm.
There's a beautiful institute up at Berkeley called the Othering Institute. Ways we just do it by accident. So even, um, you know, uh, well, I'll tell you in a moment what I'm going to even
Yeah.
you talk about. So that's one thing, just to say that these little subtle changes invite
Yeah.
the person who we're in a conversation with to think, oh, yeah, like I should be very careful because if self is a center of experience that we act on behalf of, if you just use the agency part of SPA,
Right.
then what we want to do is have our lives be invested in we care, right? The way you are framing it, where I'm going to care for the inner experience that's happening in the body I was born into, and I'm going to care for the inner experience of all these bodies that are within many people around besides this one I was born into. And collectively, we are also going to not only differentiate all the inners, we're going to realize there's all the inters, right? The
Mhm.
relational aspect of our connections to each other. Whether you call that intraconnected or we or whatever, or just we, whatever you call it. But here's the beauty of trying to be careful about the words is that it really is a kind of invitation for all of us to reverse engineer the way language can be both liberating and limiting.
Mhm.
You get a word like self and it's used for the individual experience, and then we use it just off the cuff, self-compassion or self-care or caring for yourself or stuff like that, which is so natural to say. Beautiful. What's wrong with that? Well, here's what's wrong with it. Linguistically, it turns around and goes down backwards and makes you go, okay, yeah, yeah, I need to care for myself. That's cool. Myself is a center of experience from which I act on behalf of it. Okay, that's fine. Well, well, if there's another human being or another species, that's not me. That's the other. And so, what do I care if I build a factory or ignore people who are suffering? It doesn't really matter. They're not me. I don't act on behalf of them. So that's at the extreme, and we don't want to go all the way where you just lose your individuality. So, like, I had a
Sure.
graduate student who did his PhD in Ubuntu. And so he was working with me, and I said, I love this Ubuntu, which is from South Africa, where you say, I am because we are. And I said to him, Ubuntu is muy, isn't it? He goes, absolutely not.
Mm.
I said, what? He goes, I'm going to send you my 700-page dissertation, which proves that it's not. I go, okay. And he sent it to me, and I read every word. Now, other people have different opinions about Ubuntu, and this is someone who grew up in South Africa, got his doctorate degree in Ubuntu. What happened in his view, and this is just one view, was that the individual is lost to become a part of the collective. I
Mm.
am because we are, or I am because you are, what he says in his dissertation is the only way I can truly exist is if I melt into the opinion of the whole and
Mm.
be a part of we, is what he says. And that's where we, for him, was not Ubuntu. And I was so sad. So I was looking and looking and looking, and the only place I could find it, um, there are a number of cultures that kind of have elements of it, but in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks
Mhm.
about in the Potawatomi Nation, it is specifically stated that the individual has an obligation to develop their individual gifts that are different across different people. They're differentiated. And
Yeah.
then bring those gifts that they've now been encouraged to develop for the collective good so that there is an offering back to the service of the whole without
Mhm.
losing the individual gifts that each of them can cultivate. And I
Yeah.
went, oh my gosh. So I put it in the book IntraConnected, but they don't have a word exactly for that. But that's the idea of an integrated approach. It's reciprocity. Thank
Mhm.
you. You know, I was teaching in Hawaii through the lens of aloha, uh, which has a similar kind of view of doing things for the collective. And there were two sisters who were teaching right after me. And one got up and talked about the importance of reciprocity. And the other sister said, you're missing the whole point.
Mm.
Reciprocity means there's an individual,
Mm.
no, want to be collective. And they had this kind of sisterly banter where the one who had said reciprocity was an artist, the other one was more intellectual. And so the artist backed down and said, oh, yeah, 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 I'm sorry. I misspoke. I didn't know the science. I didn't know. And I went afterwards and I said, because I didn't want to do it publicly, I went afterwards. I said, it is reciprocity. Read Robin Wall Kimmerer's next book. And also, reciprocity implies the integrated nature of things. So
Mm.
you can have the individual honored, unlike the
Yeah.
other sister was saying. So it was an interesting moment of tension between these two sisters. And so that's where the we word seems to have something to it that maybe, did your dad say why he resonated with it?
I think it was a resonance of, acknowledging he was looking out for his personal well-being and also feeling supported and connected to his community. So I think it was a moment of integration for him, in that sense. And I think the broader context of what you're saying, first of all, I'm just delighted to hear your way of talking about we care. So I was gonna maybe ask you that, although I didn't know if I'd have the chance today. So I'm so glad that you did that. And when I initially reached out to you, I said one of the things I said was, I'm so glad. I'm disappointed in a way, but I'm also glad that I wrote my book before I read yours. I don't know if you remember me saying that,
Yes, I
but
do.
the reason is, and I still stand by that. I think that as much as I resonate with what you're saying, and I said to you in that discussion too, it's really hard to disagree with Dan Siegel. I think
Oh,
people will
talk to people in
understand
my
that.
family. That's not true.
but but my sense is that it's helpful for people to have multiple possible entryways into this more integrated way of understanding care. And you might have, I don't think you're being overly finicky. I think it's brilliant, the sort of framing that you're offering. But I think that maybe it wouldn't resonate equally well with everyone to use the word we, the way that it does for some. And my hope is that by having, this other possible framework, that I think is accomplishing something similar in terms of approaching integrated care and getting away from sort of too much differentiation or excess linkage, that we're offering sort of multiple pathways into this kind of broader awareness. And ideally, and I'll say this, on this call, ideally, people can benefit from both of these different perspectives, from both of these books. As I think about it, Dan, and this is getting really technical, but you sort of got a little technical there too. Um, I think that one way of thinking about this is that we're trying to point to something. It's a little bit like the finger pointing at the moon, but it's even a little more challenging than that because we're trying to find this optimal way of introducing new terms and rethinking the way that we use terminology. Like for me now, self-care is about an emphasis. It's not about a distinction, a firm distinction. Um, that kind of weave together or braid together what in contemplative tradition sometimes is referred to as absolute truth which is that you and I are one. Ultimately, there's no distinction from that perspective of kind of oneness experience. And then more relative truth, which is that on an everyday basis, we need to make these distinctions between my body and my brain and your body and your brain, and to navigate the complexity of that with things like setting boundaries that maybe support and align with our mission in the world, and also help bridge and create connection and so on. So I think in that process, which both of us, I would embrace the idea that this is an experiment, right? We're both experimenting with introducing new terms and exploring new language. Both of us are, I think, aiming for this hybridity where it's not collapsing into one truth or the other, that we're not being, purely into, oneness, and you and I are not differentiated at all, nor are we being, the opposite, vice versa. I think that we care, fortunately, and I know you supported the book, so I think you agree with this, but is doing that where it's presenting this more integrated understanding. And how exactly we do that and what specific language we use, I think it's good that there's these different options for people. And my hope is that We Care offers that, but that people don't stop there. And there's this potential to embrace both an intraconnected view and the frame that you're offering, and the potential for this deepening of identity. And, they could use, if they like to still use the term self-care or self-compassion, if they find those terms useful, at least in the short term, of sort of transitioning toward a sort of more we compassion view or a we care view, that they have those options as well.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful way of framing it. I do uh, feel, just to honor the power of words,
Yeah.
that we need to be, I think, really respectful that words can come back and grab us, whether it's the words we generate or even how artificial intelligence is all based on these large language models, right? So we're kind of in Teilhard Chardin's view, we're in this noosphere. So it's sometimes hard, like a fish swimming in an aquarium, to see the water you're in.
Hmm.
So I do agree that in general people need time. I would have a fun little pushback on your comparing it to the
Sure.
relativistic versus
Sure.
universal in the
Yeah.
following way. Um, the loss of individualism in a collectivistic, extremely collectivistic view is kind of the fear of people in individualistic cultures. So this contrast of me to we, for someone embedded in our individualistic modern world, is filled with all sorts of terror that I'm going to lose myself if I actually start thinking in we terms.
Mhm.
So, however, we're going to try to gently do that. We care, whatever it's going to be. I think there needs to be a very conscientious, intentional identification of the language that we're imprisoned by.
Mhm.
And this word self, whenever it's used to be a synonym for the individual,
Yeah.
continues our imprisonment. So obviously I wrote the foreword to your book, so I believe in your book. I think it's a fantastic book, and taken the
Thanks.
way you're really describing it, it's integrative for sure. Otherwise, I would
Yeah.
not have written the foreword. And at the same time, the first part about it, where it's from self-care to we care, you know, we care is self-care when you think of self as relational, right?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
this is why, and I told you that when I told you my hesitations, and I think I put in the forward. So, you know, if we could put quotes around stuff like that with our fingers or in the words, and just,
Yeah.
the word conversation is very interesting. Con is with and verse is to turn. A conversation is turning our attention together.
Mm.
So if these words and concepts can invite people to wake up out of automatic pilot
Yeah.
and turn our collective attention to these deep issues, I think we can start to turn human cultural evolution in the right direction.
Mm.
So I'm 100% with you on this. I think your book is fantastic. I think people starting to really see relationships as fundamental to who they are as inner beings, because then you
Yeah.
have three things basically going on. You have, wow, I'm not just my inner world. I'm also the world of other people. And you put it in good quotes for other people. And then what I can do is see there's also a third entity, which in science we might call it a relational field, but there
Mm.
is a relationality that's me, there's you, and there's we,
Mhm.
right? And we actually in the brain, you can show that you make in these different regions three kinds of maps in your own brain that map out what's going on inside of this body called Dan. Oh, what's going on inside of Jordan? Oh, what's going on between Jordan and me, and then among all of us listening to this conversation. So I
Mhm.
can have three maps going on at the same time. So in a deep way, I think we care honors all three maps.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
me, you, and it's we. It's a clunky word, we, but however we're going to do it. But when you read your beautiful book, Jordan, I think it's really honoring those three maps,
Mhm.
and each of them are differentiated, and
Yeah.
they're all about the self.
Mm.
Because what goes on in Jordan inside of your body is what I want to act on behalf of, which is
Mhm.
one way we're defining an aspect of self. This body here called Dan, I want to act on behalf of it. The trees I see through this window out here, I want to act on behalf of them.
Mhm.
So, and then there's all of us, all of us together, that's the relational
Yeah.
field, which is the intra-connected notion. So I think that's the journey. And I think as we move forward, like my student from the Lakota tribe said to me, don't do me to we. She was really beautifully emphatic that if we try to go in linguistically that way, we're going to
Yeah.
get in trouble. So that's why, I think this conversation is so important for us to be having.
Yeah. It's so rich too. Yeah. I'm glad that we've touched on it again here. And what you're just speaking about, Dan, relates to this concept that's in your book called the identity lens. And
Huh.
I have a similar concept in We Care that I call the adaptable we. Now, maybe we would say adaptable we, which, by the way, just in terms of carrying this conversation forward, Dan, I want to again say, my commitment is to continue to share both perspectives and carefully, share that when I'm presenting on We Care so that we avoid these kind of traps, of kind of either or thinking as much as
Mhm.
possible. But I have this quote here from Dr. Mampela Rempele, who is a South African scholar and activist, and even I think now politician, and was recently shared on Mind and Life Institute's social media. So shout out to Mind and Life. And it says, our tendency is to draw our we too small, limiting our circle of care to family and friends. And so I thought this related well with your idea of the identity lens. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that. And I have a sort of maybe provocative question about that, which is whether you think that the identity lens should sort of always expand outward, if it's ideal for us to keep expanding our identity lens outward, or if it's better sometimes to sort of shrink back down our identity lens in terms of emphasis at times. So,
Yeah, no, I think the flexibility of the identity lens allows integration to emerge. So sometimes that lens can be close in. If I have a body ache and I need to see, do I have appendicitis? I gotta be attending to the signals within this body. That's
mm,
me, right?
yeah,
I can feel a tension in a relationship, and then I have to attend with a much broader lens to the relational field. What might I have done in this body with this person who I'm miscommunicating with that got them to really be frowning and look sad and pull back. So I need to then attend to the relational field, what happened between us. And then I might want to say, as I'm speaking to the person B,
yeah,
tell me about your experience. So now I'm going to the you map, right? And so what's happening inside of you if it were you and me, Jordan? So
yeah,
yeah, you want to be able to do that. But here's the thing about empathy and compassion. I mean, empathy allows us to bring in a resonance with the internal state of someone else, and we don't have to become over identified with them. But
Mhm.
another part of empathy, in addition to, understanding their point of view and taking their perspective and, and also having a cognitive understanding, is we can take joy in their successes, empathic joy, but also there's an empathic concern, which is the window into compassion. So then
Mhm.
we feel the suffering of quote, well, let's not even use the word other, but it's usually said the other person. But we feel the suffering in a person. Let's just say it that way.
Mhm.
That could be the person that's whose body we were born into, a person who's in a different body, but we feel
Yeah.
the suffering. We imagine what we could do to reduce that suffering, and then we take action, even if it's just bearing witness, to reduce the
Yeah.
suffering. So that's compassion. So this is where, like, I'm going to be speaking at Paul Gilbert's compassion, you know, gathering in I guess October, and compassion directed inwardly and compassion directed outwardly, let's use the body as a reference point, is all compassion.
Mhm.
And we don't need a separate world of quote self-compassion training, because
Yeah.
what you want to do is have this window of tolerance made wide to hold suffering
Mhm.
internally or inside a relationship or inside a person in a different body than yours. Um, so when you try to, or it may sound clunky to use language like that, but what the exercise does in trying to speak like that, so notice I didn't use the word other, is it really
Yeah.
lets you feel into this. I think what you really mean by we care, Jordan, is
Mhm.
that we care is saying there's an inner that is within the body of the person who's the focus that moment. There's the inner of bodies in distinct somatic forms, somatic capsules, and there's a relational world,
Mhm.
that also needs to be taken care of that can be suffering. You see this in
Yeah.
ecosystems, sadly, all the time. And
Yeah.
we've experienced fires here in Southern California. You can feel it in the relational world here of what's happened in our connection with nature, with these
Mhm.
fires burning down so many homes and so much natural area of forests. So anyway, so this compassion is something that I think we care naturally embraces,
Mhm.
and it embraces this integrated way of being. Someone
Yeah.
did put up something in the chat I just want to comment on. In some, as in some contemplative writings, people say, let's get rid of the self. And what I tried to say in the IntraConnected book, and this relates to your point about relativistic versus universal, is
Yeah.
the experience of sensation, perspective, and agency, if we define that as the word self, is not something you need to get rid of. And this comes to your point. It's something to expand with an identity lens.
Mhm.
Um, that when your body's gone, sure, maybe you won't have a self. But
Yeah.
while you've got a body, there is a self experience,
Right.
sensation, perspective, and agency. The problem is in modern culture, we've limited that to the individual. And so people in contemplative traditions have named that, the self that needs to be gotten rid of, or the self that's a delusion. And,
Mhm.
some very activated conversations I've had with the inner selves of people who believe you shouldn't have a self. It's so sad because
Mhm.
if you have a body, there's going to be the experience of self. There is no need to get rid of it. It's
Mhm.
just a matter of integrating it into a
Mhm.
wider expanse.
Yeah.
And that's a different approach than saying, let's get rid of the self. And,
Right.
that would be a further discussion we could have with other scholars, about that. And, I just think the word is really important. And when you see people saying, let's have no self, I think what they really mean is don't be taken over by the individualistic ego that thinks
Yeah.
that totality of who you are, which I couldn't agree with more. But that doesn't mean you lose a sense of subjective experience, perspective, and agency, including enjoying the body you're born into.
Mhm. Yeah. We're gonna be closing soon, so I'm just gonna briefly address one thing that you talked about here, and then I have a closing question that I think will bring this point to a point what you're speaking to already. My journey to We Care in some ways started with scientific research on compassion and this dualistic division of compassion. And I found this interesting pattern in the literature where compassion science had sort of bifurcated and become very dichotomous. There were studies either on self-compassion or there were studies on compassion training for others. And there's very little at the time on relationships between them. And there was actually zero research on the fact that people could, as far as I had seen, that people could actually experience this interconnected, or we could say intra-connected compassion experience. And so my lab has since not only published, that pattern and sort of highlighted the potential for more work in this area, but we've since conducted research on people with no compassion training at all in the midst of their daily life in social interactions and how they actually experience compassion. And what we have found is that people often experience, without any training, the sense of, what we'll say is interconnected compassion or intraconnected compassion, simultaneously experiencing care for themselves in the moment and care for the other person, not as two distinct experiences, but we're very careful in how we measure this. We actually find it's one integrated feeling state where they're able to feel that care for themselves and this other person, or their inner self and the other person, yeah, the outer self,
How would you say,
as one.
yeah, say it
Yeah,
again without saying the self versus the other. How would you say the same exact thing you're saying? Because I want to see how it
yeah,
feels for all of us and you. Say
yeah.
the exact
I
same,
would
because
say,
your findings are incredibly important. How would you change the linguistics a teeny bit to
sure.
reflect what we're talking about? Because I
Yeah,
think
happy
this is
to.
such an important science finding. Go ahead.
Yeah,
It's so great,
they're able
Jordan.
to feel the flow of compassion, inward and outward simultaneously. Yeah. And
Beautiful.
interestingly, they also feel this broader sense of compassion flowing out toward beings who are not even present during the interaction. And that's happening for people without compassion training. And then we have data now that I'm analyzing to suggest that compassion training actually, helps people increase those kind of experiences. So I want to close, Dan, if you can, with
But can
this
I ask you a
question.
question? Can I
Yeah,
ask you a question
sure.
first? How
Yeah.
did you feel about that finding?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that for me, that strengthened my conviction at the time. This was years ago now, that we needed a new framework for talking about compassion and care, and that ultimately, led to more conviction in writing the book and so on. The fact that it's a natural experience, that has been an important teaching for me again and again. And I guess I feel inspired, that people have that experience, in the midst of daily life. And it makes me feel like we're, as scientific researchers who study compassion and as teachers that teach compassion, we're in some ways failing people if we don't emphasize that more interconnected or intraconnected understanding of compassion, because we're not meeting people where they already naturally want to go. So,
Beautiful.
yeah.
And Jordan, you and your work is so inspiring.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, Dan.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Can I ask one final question
Of
here
course,
to
yes,
to close
yes.
this out? So I recently heard you sing for the first time.
Oh, you did. Oh my gosh.
I tuned into a webinar, and you disclosed that it was the first for you, I think, to sing in public in that way. And the song was beautiful, Dan. And maybe we probably don't have time to hear you sing. Maybe thankfully for you, I don't know if you want to do that. But the song was talking about, I think toward the end of our life, reflecting that really what matters is what we've given away. And I have this Carl Sagan quote that I think is resonant with it as well. Who are we if not measured by our impact on others? That's who we are. We are not who we say we are, not who we want to be. We are the sum of the influence and impact we have in our lives on others. And so, as much as we're talking about this, need to direct the flow of care both inward and outward, I think ultimately, really what we're speaking to, or I guess I have a question for you around that. My sense is that ultimately, still, the longer arc of our care is toward others, is outward, toward benefiting other people or benefiting the world more broadly. And so, we're only in this body for a limited amount of time, just like you were speaking to. That means that we do need to emphasize, that inward flow of care while we're here. But at the same time, the broader arc of what we're doing should probably prioritize and privilege that outward flow of care. And so I wondered if you agreed with that in your work, and yeah, how you think about that in relation to the song that you sung and all of that, which you did great, by the way,
Oh,
singing
thank
that
you.
song.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was a webinar, and I did another webinar the last 2 days if you want to do a deeper dive even than that one. Just go to our website. You can link into it. It's for free. Um, the idea was trying to push the edge of this body and the temperament of this body, which tends to drive for certainty and avoid uncertainty. So I chose for the first time ever, as you pointed out, to sing the song. But this is Bob Sima's song, Sima, song called The Measure. And it was inspired by a little plaque on the movie It's a Wonderful Life that said, the only thing you take with you is what you've given away. And he
Mm,
wrote a whole song about it. Um, I mean, I could sing it, but rather than sing it, let me just say, you can listen to it. That the beauty of the song is it invites you to participate in this question. And these are the opening lines, tell me, what is the measure of a life well done? Tell me, how do you count an uncountable sum? And it goes on to talk about in another verse of the song, you are an accumulation of the lives that you've touched. And then it goes on to say, you're a celebration of the wind and the dust. And in this verse, it finishes up saying, you were put here for a reason,
mm,
to be of service and be a beacon.
mm,
It goes on in all sorts of incredibly beautiful ways that melt you. But I say that here because I think you are showing us that to be of service is to have outward directed compassion, but we can't forget the inward compassion too, and
mm,
that we care, which is so beautiful. And Jordan, you are being a beacon for all of us,
mm,
bringing rigorous science to something that some people might say is soft, like compassion or caring. But in fact, love, which really is what we're talking about, is what happens when integration is made visible. And you are bringing kind of the disciplined view of science and your great background in contemplative practice and bringing them together for the service of all of humanity. So,
mm.
you know,
Wow.
I
Thank
want
you
to
so
thank you.
much.
No, thank you. I thank
Yeah.
you. And that's you are singing the song. There's another line in the song that goes, you know, did you sing the song that you came to sing? And the feeling
Mm,
I have getting to know you and also reading your beautiful book is that that is the song you were brought here to sing.
mm.
And it inspires everyone to sing with you. And
Wow.
so
Yeah.
I think together, we can do we care, if you want to say it like that and bring your
Mm,
dad into it, you know, however we're going to word this. Um, and the spatial orientation is just helpful. There's an inward focus of compassion, there's an
mhm,
outward focus of compassion. Just use the skin encased body as a spatial reference and watch out for the linguistics that make you think that the body and the individuality of the body is more important than the relationality of our deep connections
mm,
with one another, and then
mm.
we're gonna be okay. And we can move cultural evolution by shaping this noosphere and
Yeah.
really massaging it towards this integrated way of being.
Mm. Wow, I couldn't end on a better note, but I do just want to say, Dan, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, for returning to Naropa today. I think you were here 10 years ago in person,
Yeah.
and returning, having you is a true delight. And I just want to say, obviously, thank you so much for your kind words right now. And I'm going to take those in even more deeply, over time. And also just for the way that you've inspired me. And I think so many people who are probably tuning in, and for all your contributions to not only this topic, but the fields of mental health and psychology and neuroscience. So you're a real inspiration, I think, to so many of us, and that includes me in my work. And I think that I wouldn't, be able to approach this topic, or this book would not be as successful, hopefully, as it. I'm hoping it can reach, people, its message, as it would be without your support in these ways. So just deep, deep gratitude to you. Yeah.
Thank,
Thank you so
thank you,
much.
Jordan. A pleasure, and I hope our paths will cross soon. And I look forward to seeing you in person sometime.
I'd love that.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Take care, Dan.
Thank you. You too. Be well.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.